Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to our next session of reading Carl Schmitt's uh, Parlamentarus, or his, what do you call, the translation we're using from the Kennedy edition, MIT published, The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. Now, today is going to be a short one because we're just looking at the introduction. Last time we read this preface to the second edition. Um, Today we're looking at the introduction to the first edition. This is the introduction of The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy by Carl Schmitt. So let's go into it. Again, introduction, first edition, 1923. As long as parliamentarism has existed, there has also been a literature criticizing it. Right? He goes right to the big note to all the literature that dealt with it. We can just go here. Hold on. Sorry. And I'm not going to really go to this for the rest of the book, but the notes here are going to be right all through it. This is the introduction to first section. He goes this whole literature. He talks about, in fact, its own chapter in political theology. Basically, talking about maybe to a great degree of his own chapter in political theology and other things. So, yeah. So, go right to the back to where we were. Sorry. It was first developed, understandably, on the ground of reaction and restoration by political opponents who were defeated in the struggle against parliamentarism. So this is by this he's giving the context of the early 17th and 18th century. The 17th century distinction between the forces of limited parliamentary government versus absolutism. Right. This is the rise. In fact, this is what he says of the origins of parliamentary state, the so-called um, legislative state. In his other writing, Legal and Legitimacy, he talks about the legislative state. Schmitt means here when he talks about the parliamentary body is this idea of the legislative state, the rise of legislatures, right? And this is the rise against the rise of absolute rule. Okay. And this is the context of the 16th century, right? This is what he's talking about in that sense. So much of the literature criticizing parliament is basically the literature against parliamentarism, right? Increasingly, practical experience brought out the deficiencies of party government, and these were then given prominence. So then, later century, like the first, it started with the kind of reaction against the fight. Those the defenders of a royal rule against against that was the first critic. Second critics was well those who have actually started working under parliamentary government in the late 18th and 19th century, and they mostly not more 19th century, who start seeing the problems of it, the limits to this and problem of party deficiency of party governments and other issues, right? Kind of like Robert Michael's political parties and things like that, right? Finally, a critique came from another principled side, from the radicalism of the left. So therefore, I mean, in many ways, the left, in many ways, political parties by Robert Michaels was a started out as a left wing critique of class and social status as being the instrument of driving the nature of political party representation. Right. The more classical argument for the liberal, it's kind of John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, right? Even Bentham in the early 19th century gives kind of a critique of some aspects of legislative rule. So, legislative government in that sense. Right? So, starting with Bentham and then later Mill's representative government, right? These were the earlier one, and then the left wing critique from the left in that sense, right? Um, Thus, right wing and left wing tendencies, conservative, syndicalist, and anarchist arguments, and the monarchist, aristocratic, and the democratic perspectives have joined have joined forces. Here has in this in other words, all these groups kind of have a criticism of parliamentary structures, right? One finds the simplest summary of the current state speech, that of Senator Mosca. Again, this is Mosca of the Genevina Mosca, the the man who wrote the ruling class, right? Part of the Italian realists, Ginato Mosca. Um, he is one of the so-called Italian realists with Michaels and Pareto, and that does this. He goes, so that a speech by Senator Mosca made in the Italian Senate on November 26, 1922, concerning the domestic and foreign policy of the Mussolini government. According to Mosca, three radical solutions offer themselves as a corrective for the deficiencies of the parliamentary system: the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, a return to the more or less disguised absolutism of bureaucracy, the una absoluto bureaucracy, right? And finally, a form of syndicalist government, that is, replacing the individual representation that exists in contemporary parliament with an organism of syndicates. The last was regarded by the speaker as the greatest danger to the parliamentary system because syndicalism springs not from doctrines and feelings, but from the economic organization of modern society. Henry Berthamille, by contrast, who expressed himself on the matter in his preface to the 10th edition of his Tracta Elementare di Droit Administration, for the elementary text of the laws of administrative law, does not consider syndicalism worth talking about at all. He believes that it is sufficient if parliamentarians recognize the dangers in a confusion of powers, give up their party business, and provide for a certain stability of administration. So, the second one is this, the administrative structures. Um, Finally, he views regionalism as well as industrialism, the application of the methods of economic politics, as a danger to the state, while saying about syndicalism that one could not take seriously a theory that believed that everything would fall into order if authority comes from those over whom it is exercised, and if the control is entrusted precisely to those who must be controlled. Right, period. So again, he's quoting from Bilith in his administrative view in that sense. Again, and syndicalism doesn't make any sense, he says, because it's those who should be, it shouldn't be these people. It should be that these people should be controlled. Control should not come from the people who should be controlled. Right. In other words, authority is to come from those whom it is exercised, and if the control is entrusted precisely to those who must be controlled. From the standpoint of a good bureaucratic administration, this is quite right. But what does it imply for democratic theory? The theory that all government authority derives from the governed, right? In other words, the democratic theory argues that all. So this is the point, and I think this is a very important point. Schmitt, in the introduction, suggests that there is a fundamental tension between this administrative law, the idea of droit administratif, right, which again is it's the middle position in Mosca's thing, because he said dictatorship of proletariat and absolute bureaucracy, absolutism of bureaucracy, right? A return to more or less disguised absolute. In other words, a bureaucratic state. This is the kind of a, you know, In fact, this is the English system, really. The crown and the parliament. That's the bureaucracy is represented by the crown. The prime minister is that weird intermediary in the English system. He's a creature created by the legislature, but he also controls the legislature. He's the agent of the legislature to control and regulate the crown, but he is also the agent of the crown to regulate and control the legislature. Right? This is Starkey's a very good point about this. I think David Starkey's right on this. But what this text, what Schmitt is doing here, is saying that there's a tension here between the bureaucratic state and democracy. They're at odds with each other because the principle is that, and Barthélemy does it correctly in understanding, explaining it. That he says that from the administrative point of view, no, that everything else, that all power comes from the top down. The administrative structure is like this. It says if authority comes from those whom from its that quote, if authority comes from those over whom it is exercised, and if the control is entrusted precisely to those who are controlled, right, everything would fall into order, right? This principle. However, this may be great from a administrative point of view. From a democratic view, it's a violation because the whole purpose of the democratic theory is what? Consent of the governed, right? That the theory that all government authority derives from the governed, right? So that's the tension, right? In Germany, there has long been a tradition of corporatist ideas and currents for which the critique of modern parliamentarism is nothing new. So therefore, this idea of corporate structure, and this is now he gives lots of notes here, and notes are useful. A literature has been developed parallel to it in the last few years concerning the everyday experience since 1919. In numerous brochures and newspaper articles, the most prominent deficiencies and the mistakes of the parliamentary enterprise have been pointed out. And what are they? Okay, what are they? The dominance of parties, their unprofessional politics of personalities, the government of amateurs, the continuing governmental crises, the purposeless and banality of parliamentary debates, the declining standard of parliamentary customs, the destructive methods of parliamentary obstruction, the misuse of parliamentary immunities and the privileges by a radical opposition which is contemptuous of parliamentary itself, the undignified daily order of business, the poor attendance in the House. So therefore, you have the list of these. And this is his from 1919 to 1923 when he's writing. This is the problem of and this is he's doing it from the German experience. And you could look at the Italian, the problem, and if you look at all the parliamentary governments, the same thing happened in Italy before the rise of the fascists, Mussolini in 1920. The rise in the problem of the Third Republic in France. All this is clearly, addressed in this sense. But let's continue here for a second. The impression based on long familiar observation has greatly spread that proportional representation and the list system destroy the relationship between voters and representatives, makes fractions an indispensable means of government in Parliament, and makes the so-called representative principle of Article 21 of the right Constitution, that the members are representatives of the whole people. They are only responsible to their own constituents and not bound but to any instructions, meaningless. Further, that the real business takes place not in the open session of the plenum, but in committees, and not even necessarily in parliamentary committees, and that the most important decisions are taken in secret meetings of faction leaders or even in extra parliamentary committees, so that responsibility is transferred and even abolished. And in this way, the whole parliamentary system finally becomes only a poor facade concealing the dominance of parties and economic interests, right? Again, this is again, I think you can get political parties by Moscow. I think and this is a very powerful argument he's saying. But notice he says, what is it? He blames this problem of this on proportional democracy. In other words, the relationship between, in other words, proportional democracy and the list system. In other words, the British system of in other words, you have individual candidate systems. The British parliamentary model, or the English model, was you didn't have a list of candidates, you had a person against another person. Now, this person might be supported by a party, but the person is the candidate. And you got to pick this person versus that person. And what happens is that representative is the representative of that community. So, single member district, not proportional, winner take all, first past the post. Now, this is Duvler's law, right? This is the problem. Duvler's law produces this kind of two-party model. The argument was that's what Duvler's famous line about um, if you have a first past the post, you have single member districts, first past the post system, and non single member districts, first past the post. The tendency is to produce a two-part, a dominant majority party and a competitive party, right? Two-party system. Whereas multi-partyism occurs when you have what? You don't have that. You have proportional representation list systems, and therefore this leads us to this leads us to a breakdown of the original parliamentary model. Instead of it being really this model, it becomes merely an aggregation of specific interests. So this is a very, his argument here about the breakdown of parliamentarism is tied to a change in democratic theory, right? About the way the voter and representation works. And he makes this argument. This is that Article 21 of the Weimar Constitution says, well, this is supposed to be this, but that means it's meaningless. It's bullshit. It's a facade. The reality is this: everything he says here, the real power is not only in committees, but also in private committees, not in their interest groups, right? This is the sad reality of parliamentary structures in this pluralist model, that it becomes a facade of where the real power lies, right? In addition to the critique, there is also a critique of democratic foundations of this parliamentary system that was more natural in the middle of the 19th century. In other words, okay, right? It developed from the classical tradition of Western European education and the fear that the educated had of dominance by the uneducated masses. A fear of democracy whose typical expression one finds in the letters of Jacob Burckhardt, Burckhardt's famous letters about this, and I think this is very interesting. It's um, I think there's even a penguin little book from Burckhardt's book on the Renaissance, where he criticizes the state, the idea, the myth of the state, right? The not the myth, but yeah, myth or the image. It's a penguin little book that I find in Kindle. Okay, but this is what he's saying here. It's very interesting. He says here what he says. By the uneducated mass, a fear of democracy is a typical expression of Burkhardt. In its place, there has long been since developed an investigation of the methods and techniques which the parties create electoral propaganda, persuade the masses, and dominate public opinion. So, therefore, the original one was kind of this idea of elite mass. In the 19th century argument, Burkhardt and people like Ortega Gasset, was this fear of the masses that the educated people had of the masses. This you see this a little bit in Tocqueville. You see this in Burkhardt. You see this and like this. But in the as we go later, as we move to the end of the 19th century and into 20th century, you have a new interpreter. This is based upon what? The nature of investigating the methods and techniques in which the parties create electoral propaganda, persuade the masses, and dominate public opinion. Ostrowski's work on the parties, modern democracy, is typical of this kind of literature. Belloc and Chesterton's party system made the critique popular. So therefore, this is originally Ostrowski's work, but then Hillel, Belloc, and Chesterton in their book Party System. Right, and then he says, uh, 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 made this critique popular, Ostrowski's book. And then he goes, the sociological investigations of party life, most famously, the famous book by Robert Michaels, Political Parties, right, destroyed numerous parliamentary and democratic illusions without separating the one from the other. In other words, political parties it shows about democracy and about again lead theory, right? This is one of the books that begin the Italian school of lead theory, right? But then also so therefore criticizes democracy, but also criticizes parliamentary structures. Um, uh, 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 Destroyed numerous parliamentary democracies without separating one from the other, right? Still, because that sense. Essentially, even non-socialists recognized the collusion of press, party, and capital, and treated politics only as a shadow of economic reality. So therefore, even the non-socialist, even the things that all of a sudden this is, in many ways, this is behavioralism. Behavioralism understood this in the same way. The behavior, the positivists and behavioralists of the interest group model, right? Look at this way in this kind of situation. This is not even socialist. You can say the behavioralists, but also the rational choice people, right? The institutionalists and these guys in political science all again uh, look at the collusion of these forces, press, party, and capital, and treated politics only as a shadow of economic reality. One can assume that this literature is generally well known. The scholarly interest of the following investigation is not intended either to confirm or to refute it, but is rather an attempt to find the ultimate core of the institution of modern parliament. So what is the core? What is the institution of modern parliament? Accordingly, it will be shown that the ultimate system from which modern parliamentarism develops is scarcely discernible in the term of the current political and social thought, and how far the institution itself has lost its moral and intellectual foundations and remains standing through sheer mechanical preservation as an empty apparatus. So this is Schmitt's point is very interesting. He wants to know what the core is. In other words, he's not interested in saying these criticisms are wrong. He wants to know, okay, what is the core of parliamentary structure and parliamentary government, the parliamentary legislative state? And his argument is, well, there is none. It's a hollow thing. And what justifies it, what really only remain justifying is not its own moral principle or intellectual principle. It doesn't have one. It's empty. He's arguing there's none. There's no new justification for itself, but except these other justifications that have been kind of shown to be not valid anymore, and rather merely a facade for these other pluralistic interest group approaches of sectors of interest, right? But he says it's only surviving, it's only continuing by its it has. He says that the institution itself lost its moral and intellectual foundation. So there's no intellectual moral foundation anymore for it. Rather, it's only standing by the sheer mechanical preservation of an empty apparatus. The institutional structure. It's institution that the structure is still there, and it's the mechanism of it is working, and it's still being, even though that its soul and its rationale has been shown to be not valid, right? Um, Only when they grasp the situation intellectually could reform proposals gain perspective. So, in other words, he's not saying destroy it. He's saying that, well, wait, no. We have to understand what's wrong, and only by understanding what's wrong, only when they grasp the situation intellectually, could real reform of the parliamentary model gain perspective. Okay, so this is, in other words, this is a critique of a thing, that legislative state, but trying to save it in that sense. Okay, it's now We always see Schmitt as a kind of, oh my God, he's just a fascist, and right? No, but it's more complicated here. He's trying to preserve it in this sense and try to find a way to kind of maybe offer real reform that can maintain it or at least allow it to survive or challenge the things that challenge it, right? Concepts such as democracy, liberalism, individualism, and rationalism, all of which are used in connection with modern parliament, must be more clearly distinguished so that they cease to be provisional characterizations and slogans. So we have to understand these things, these different concepts. Democracy, liberalism, individualism, and rationalism. All these are connected with modern parliament, right? But we have to distinguish them so that they don't be provisional characterizations and slogans. Only then can there be shift away from tactical and technical questions to intellectual principles. So instead of moving from technical and tactical questions of politics to more intellectual principles, and a starting point that does not once again leads to a dead end, and a starting point that leads. So therefore, the problem is most legislative defenses that he sees of the parliamentary system are tactical, not really kind. It doesn't, and they don't lead to overcoming the crisis of that the intellectual crisis. Now, there's the crisis for Schmitt here is that there's an intellectual crisis of the legislative state, and it needs to be resolved by intellectual grounds. And only coming to terms with that and understanding these concepts clearly can you then make an intellectual reform of the thing. Otherwise, you'll just only have what he says tactical and technical things that only lead to dead ends. And you need only if you get to the intellectual principles and get to a starting point that does not lead to a dead end. And this is how he ends the introduction. And from there, he will turn to our next chapter, which again discusses democracy and parliamentarism. Well, okay, that's it. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below. If you liked it, you liked it. You didn't like it. I understand. This is the way the cookie crumbles. If you didn't like it, say why and tell me what's wrong, what was done wrong, and maybe I can do it. I didn't like some. If you have any, again, like I said, any comments, questions, or issues that you want more explanation of, please put them below. And when I see them, I'll respond. If you've liked it, again, share it with a friend, share it on your social media, get the news out there. If you have not subscribed, please subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. The next thing we be doing, you can follow me on social media. Links are below. There's also links to my academic social media about my scholarship and about me as a scholar, what I do. Then, if you want to help me, what I do, you can do so by links to Patreon or Subscribe Star below. Of course, people say, there's no opening there anyways. Why are you doing it? You're giving it away for free. Okay, this is true, and I'm not getting funded by Google because I'm not watched enough. This is tough, right? I'm not that popular. I should do my video on something. Okay. What else? That's about it. The other way you can help me is by one of my books. The links are below. And that is that. I'll see you next time when we look at the next chapter thing of Schmitt, reading Carl Schmitt's Parliamentary or the Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. Take care and have a great day.